Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you for joining our webinar. It is my pleasure to open this webinar following the launch of the latest Yeast LalBrew Pomona in collaboration with Escarpment Labs. Maybe you can share the screen, Molly, and see if that works.
Yes. Let's go. All right. Hopefully you guys should see the screen.
Can someone confirm? Oh, well, I can see it, so that should work.
Perfect. Yeah, that's we can see it.
I'm Sylvie van Zandycke, the Director of Sales and Marketing at Brewing. I joined the company back in 2004 and I held a number of positions with the company starting in the lab. I've seen numerous products being launched through the years, and if there's one satisfying thing about growing old, it's looking back and appreciate what a journey and what a long way we've come as a team and as a business. There was a time where dry yeast wasn't the quality brewers were expecting, and there was also little options in terms of strains available in dry form. So much has been learned and implemented, and the last 20 years that I am really proud to say that we have turned a major corner. There is no compromise being made with the quality of our yeast, and there is still a continuous desire to improve. With a wish to innovate, the strains that we make available to brewers are unique, well-defined, and well-aligned with market needs and trends. They meet the expectations of our brewers and when it comes to flavor and performance. In light of this, it is important to forge meaningful relationships with passionate people that align with our values and strategy. I am proud to say that our partnership with Escarpment Labs has been exactly that. Escarpment Labs is based in Guelph, Ontario, in Canada, and it's an innovative yeast company that focused on developing new strains and help brewers brew their best beer. Behind the business aspect of all of this, it is mind-blowing that after so many years, we are still able to find people that love geeking about yeast as much as we do. And this leads me to formally introduce our speakers for today. And beside being two passionate people about yeast and beer, they also can be found singing karaoke. And this is not the purpose of this presentation, but I'd like to let you know that next time you bumped into them at conferences, please hit them up on that, and I can assure you, you'll have a good time. So let's start with Molly. Molly is the technical support manager and also our Japan technical sales manager for Brewing. She actually started her brewing career in Japan with Baird Brewing, and she worked at various breweries in the US as well, and is specialized in barrel aging beer, including a stint with Brooklyn Beer Brewery. And after this, she joined Brewing in 2018, and she's been with us since then. She lives in Raleigh, North Carolina. Molly has a master's degree in brewing and distilling from Heyot-Watt University and is also a graduate of the American Brewers Guild. She is the current VP of the Master Brewers Association. And by the way, don't forget to register for World Brewing Summit. Help me here, Molly.
World Brewing Congress.
World Brewing Congress, thank you, in Minneapolis this summer. And she was also the founding president of MBA District Carolinas. So I mixed World Brewing Congress with Brewing Summit. That's an interesting one. And then let me introduce Richard. Richard is the co-founder of Escarpment Labs. It's a yeast producer in Guelph, Ontario, in Canada. He guides the company's R&D efforts and acts as the connecting point between sales, laboratory, and production activities. Richard graduated from the University of Guelph with a Master's of Science in Molecular Biology and Genetics. He is active in the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, just like Molly, and serve on the National Technical Committee as president of District Ontario. So with this, I will wish you a great webinar. I will be back at the end when we're going to look at the questions. And we have roughly an hour altogether, so let's make sure we can go through as many as the question as possible. There is a specific button that you can push on the right-hand side where you can ask your questions. It's better to do it that way than in the chat, but if you do it in the chat, we'll move it to the right place. So please enjoy, and Molly, you can take over.
Sure. Thank you, Sylvie. I just want to add that Richard's karaoke voice is a lot better than mine, as the Lalaman technical team will attest to. So just a little plug for Richard to drag him into karaoke at WBC.
I'm always up.
Yep. So really quickly, this is what we're going to go over today, how the rest of the talk's going to pan out. We're going to look at what is LalBrew Pomona, discuss some flavor and fermentation aspects of it, then dive into some lab biotransformation data and some commercial trial results, finishing on some brewing considerations. And then I'm going to hand it over to Richard, and he's going to discuss how he and his team at Escarpment Labs created Pomona. We'll end on some feedback and frequently asked questions, some resources to give you all. And then, as Sylvie said, we want to hear questions from you guys as well. So with that, we'll start it off. So what is LalBrew Pomona? In a nutshell, it is a hybrid yeast. It's a Saccharomyces cerevisiae strain that was selected for flavor and fermentation performance in hoppy beers. It was developed by Escarpment Labs using advanced yeast breeding and adapted laboratory technology, which Richard will dive into more about what those technologies are. It is a non-genetically engineered strain. It's non-GMO. It is a hybrid. And it was developed really with some unique biotransformation properties, which we are going to dive in more about discussion on what those are, but principally really juicy peach flavor and tropical fruits. So for some quick technical info, it is STA negative and is POF negative, so it's non-diastaticus, it is a non-phenolic strain. This information can be found on our TDSs. The fermentation time, as you see, is very quick, and that was something that Escarpment Labs was part of that development process, was making sure that this yeast had a really robust fermentation performance, and fermentation time was part of that. Flocculation is medium. The optimal temperature range, something to note there, that it is between 18 and 22 C. We really don't see any benefit going outside of this range. Those fruity kind of fruit, or those fruity like citrus, peach, and tropical fruit characteristics, those are really coming from the yeast and hop interaction, not so much esters, although there's one particular ester that we'll talk about where Pomona does seem to shine a little bit more. But really, your temperature is not a huge lever in terms of sensory characteristics. Your attenuation and alcohol tolerances and the ranges, those are pretty average. I will note that those are in laboratory conditions. We have seen outside of these ranges in commercial trials, which we'll dive into more as well. So let's get down to some fun facts. We have some biotransformation data that we received from our partners at Oregon State University in Oregon and Niagara College in Canada. And both these institutions brewed a beer, and they did side-by-side comparisons using Verdant and Pomona. They brewed a single batch of wort, and they split that batch into two separate batches. So batch went to Verdant and batch went to Pomona. It wasn't intentional, but both of the beers ended up slightly similar in terms of specs. So roughly the same OG, roughly the same finishing gravity, same attenuation. pretty similar fermentation temperatures and also pretty similar mash temperatures. Their mash temperatures are around 68 to 69C. Their mash bill was also fairly similar, incorporated some flaked oats and flaked wheats. The biggest differences and what we kind of see in terms of we'll see in terms of like hop characteristics is their hop additions and their uses of their choice of hops, and that really plays out in the differences we see with terpenes, thiols, and what we'll discuss later, lactones. So for some flavor compound analysis, the big takeaway here is that these are your acetaldehydes, this is your esters, and some higher alcohols. Everything pretty much looks normal. There's really no big outliers. Collectively, Pomona does lean towards the fruitier esters. And in particular, the biggest outlier here is isoamyl acetate. So this is an ester that really drives banana and fruitier characteristics. And you can see those orange and that blue bars, the Pomona really shines in this characteristics. This is really good to know because we'll discuss later on where their lactones in particular, this type of compound tends to play or have synergistic interaction with esters. So this ester in particular could be considered an important one in that synergistic relationship. Now to get to some fun hop data. So these are terpene data, and terpenes again are really your citrus, fruity, floral, some pine in there. And what we see here is that we have two different well, first, terpenes come in free and bound forms, right? What we see here is that both Pomona and Verdant really express some terpenes really well, but with the differences being with OSU, their batches of beer, they had a double dry hop here, so that probably interplayed well with this increase in linalool. You also have some terpenes that are released, this beta citronella, released via yeast esterification. And so we see some evidence here of that citronella being released as well. For thiols are, of course, the interesting, the topic of hop chemists and brewers around. And I'm not a hop chemist, but very briefly, their thiols are very small but powerfully aromatic compounds. They can come in free and bound forms, with the bound forms needing a yeast, an enzyme from the yeast to release those bound forms into free aromatic sensory aspects. The one of the things that should be noted with thiols is that they are very hard to measure. So for here, we've measured two of them. We measured 3-MeH, or 3-MH, which presents as passion fruit and grapefruit, and then 4-MMP, which presents as blackcurrant. And the really interesting thing to note here, as you see, is the 3-MH being really quite obviously high in the Niagara College beers. And one reason for this, we hypothesize, has to do with hop selection. So Niagara College, they used Mosaic in a day 5 dry hop. And Mosaic is known to be high in bound thiols. So we can hypothesize here that those bound thiols were being released somehow into more of that, to release some of that grapefruit, passion fruit flavors. The OSU hops, for their dry hop, they were mainly Cascade, Vista, and Strata. So we don't really have great thiol research on those, on what was released from there, but you can see that there was some release. It is also important to note that for both of these thiols, they are way above threshold. So the thresholds are really, the sensory threshold is really, really tiny. Both for Niagara College and OSU, they are above threshold. With Pomona releasing a little bit more of that passion fruit. Now, so with thiols and terpenes, we are coming. We want to present a story of Pomona is just not a single character yeast. That it has a lot of complexity and a lot of sensory complexity, and part of that is due to the interaction between thiols and terpenes, but also what we were hypothesizing are lactones. And lactones are really interesting because they haven't really been studied much in beer, but they are hypothesized, they're known to be a source of some coconut, peach aromas in other fermented beverages. Lactones, they come from, they are compounds that are formed by the yeast converting fatty acids into cyclical esters, and malt and hops happen to be really great sources of these fatty acids. So therefore, we were hypothesizing, well, beer is made of malt and hops, obviously. What would be the interaction, or how much lactose are beers being made with Pomona and with Verdant releasing, or what amount of compounds are in there? What are these concentrations? What are they looking like? The earlier research done on lactones from Shellhammer's lab, they commented that lactones really play a part in overall sensory intensity, particularly when they interplay with terpenes and esters. So they are hypothesized to make a really great backbone. One point that this paper did note as well is that lactones by themselves are interesting sensorially, but when they are combined with esters and terpenes, they noticed a dramatic sensory increase in those peach and tropical characteristics. So for OSU and Niagara College, we see a plethora of lactones. We put the compounds here in this table along with their sensory descriptors and their thresholds. And you can see the thresholds are these are sensory thresholds. You can see the thresholds are quite small, and Pomona is above threshold for these coconut and fruity tropical characteristics. The differences between these two beers, you can see there is some variation. Really, we don't understand why. It's not really due to a specific hop or a specific malt, but we can collectively say that, the way that the grist composition and the overall grist composition, the overall hop composition of these beers contributed to the differences in these specific lactones. But generally speaking, you were looking at Pomona as lactones being considered a source of coconut, peach, and tropical fruits. But taken together collectively with terpenes and thiols, they're painting a really great picture of a yeast that will give a beer great complexity in terms of tropical fruit aroma. It's not going to be a single note of just passion fruit. It's going to be layered, creating really great opportunities for beers to be made of many different styles, many different types of IPAs. And that kind of bears out in the sensory done at OSU. They conducted a triangle test. So Verdant, and they were looking at obviously Verdant and Pomona, and they first wanted to ask, could you tell a difference between these two beers? Because on paper they look very similar, right? And when they did the triangle test was done blind, they found they could. Most respondents could pick out the difference between Verdant and Pomona, which really shows you that you could have two beers on tap made with these yeasts, and your customers, your consumers will be able to have two very different beers and that will both be delightful. It also shows you that both these yeast really help expand that catalog of IPA yeast in general, and also IPA styles in particular. When asked for preference, they did prefer Pomona, but I would note here that this is the first time that the OSU had a chance to brew with this beer or with this yeast. So, we got a lot of feedback from commercial trials saying, well, now we know how Pomona acts in fermentation. We would tailor a beer or tailor a recipe specifically to enhance those properties. And we'll talk about some tips and tricks for how to do that later on. So let's go into some commercial trials. So we conducted commercial trials all over the globe, and these were the averages that came out of there. So average pitch rate, 79 grams per hectoliter, pretty standard. Average fermentation temp was 20C, again, pretty standard. That's 68F for those in North America. Average fermentation time to attenuation was 5 days. If you included a dry hop there, it's 9 days. So that really does bring home the idea of and acts as evidence of this strain being a robust strain where you don't have to worry about it lingering in your tank for too long. And some of the survey results that we'll go over to support that as well. Your average mash temperature is 67 degrees C, and the average attenuation is 77. But we did want to note that's a range. There was a range between 59% and 87% attenuation. So it can really push up into higher attenuation levels should you with. And then average biotransformation potential on the survey is 3.3. This is collective biotransformation. So we did ask some particular questions about terpenes and thiols, but in general, when you look at biotransformation as a whole, this strain really gives a big, powerful, complex picture. And then average haze is 4 out of 5. So really stable, really nice haze. To dive in a little bit further, so fermentation performance, 60% of respondents said the fermentation performance was, the time was short to very short. This drives home the fact that, you can put this strain in your tank and not have to worry about it. Also, it won't linger in your tank, so your tank residency times will be quite short. Attenuation level, again, we're seeing that 76% that most respondents reported, but then there were outliers getting up into the mid-80s. And all this brings the other side of this, of that short fermentation time, you're reaching attenuation. What about off flavors? Little to none. So again, supporting the fact that this is a really robust strain. It was really designed to be a performance workhorse in your brewery and something you don't really have to worry about, while also giving you great aromatic, really juicy flavors and stable haze. So we really don't see any sulfur, little to no diacetyl, little to no acetaldehyde in commercial trials. So when we asked to describe the aroma overall of Pomona, it was really overwhelmingly positive with notes of peach early in fermentation, and that gave way to tropical. Some respondents picked out citrus, apricot, and stone fruit. Generally, half the respondents mentioned citrus here. And then when they mentioned tropical, there were also specific notes of guava, mango, and pineapple that were picked out. We asked about overall biotransformation level. So again, that was 3.3 out of 5. But then when we specifically dug into, okay, what are terpenes? And we named terpenes as citrus, pine, and floral. What are thiols? How do you perceive their tropical passion fruit guava? We didn't list lactones because not a lot of people would know what we're talking about. But here you kind of see that really great picture of both of these compounds interplaying. And, now that we have this lactone data, we can say, okay, pretty sure there's some lactose coming to this party as well, and making this a really great picture of a yeast strain that gives an overall really healthy, really dynamic biotransformation potential. For the respondents that included hops at Knockout or Whirlpool, they mostly used Citra and Mosaic, and they rated somewhat high to high. So that kind of gives some supporting evidence to leaning towards some thiol freeing, some terpene freeing from these hops. And then those respondents who listed somewhat high in terpenes, they also listed thiols between medium and high. So this suggests, again, that interplay of between these two compounds, but also that overall, highlighting the overall aromatic intensity that this yeast can bring to your beer. Survey response for haze, pretty high haze. When we did get a lot of respondents, that responded, okay, this haze, we see it as very hazy. And then they commented later on as well that it still remains hazy. So, we're pretty confident saying that this beer will present a very stable haze. However, if you did want to clarify this, bring that haze down a little bit, that is possible. We had several respondents add some clarifying agents or centrifuge, and then the beer cleared up pretty nicely as well. So it isn't an irrevocable haze, but it is a haze that is responsibly hazy. And then really quickly, some key takeaways. So what you should take home from these trials. So fast fermentation, short lag phase. It's really suitable for highly hopped, high gravity beers, which it was designed to be a yeast strain for this, which we should talk about. Really expressing some distinctive peach, citrus, and tropical aromas. So that complex flavor spectrum is being supported here by these trials, supporting that excellent biotransformation potential and the stable haze. So before I give it over to Richard, we wanted to discuss some brew considerations that brewers should think about when using Pomona. So how to optimize biotransformation. I want to give a shout out to our biotransformation champions, Carlos and Scott. I'm not an expert on biotransformation by any means, but we have some really great resources at LalBrew Brewing, and our champions are working on more. So we're hoping to bring out, the latest and greatest in our research and our partners' research to you all. But in general, and from what we saw with the lab data, we can see Pomona in the combination with the right hops can release really punchy terpene aromatics, but overall release some really great aromatics in general. We do see that release of beta-citronellol. So this is created through the biotransformation of geraniol found in hops via the yeast, so via Pomona. So an idea for you to get the most out of this is to select hops that are high in free geraniol, so Matoica, Bravo, for example, Cascade, Mosaic, etc. Add your yeast, and then release the citronellol. And you'll get these really nice lemon, lime, punchy citrus characteristics. You could also select a hop variety in free terpene, so they already had that free geraniol, already had the free beta-citronellol released. That are already set to go. So Matoica would be an example of that. And then to enhance stone fruit and citrus. So again, these are it's thought to be a combination of lactones, terpenes, and esters. But you can reinforce it with some stone fruity hops, so Simcoe, Raku. And then we did have one commercial trial that used Pomona as a yeast for kettle souring after the kettle souring was finished. And they found that it really created some really nice peach apricot aromas as well. So you can reinforce that with fruit additions of the actual peach, actual apricot. Pomona would make a really great base for that. And before I give it to Richard, here's some practical tips for using Pomona. We did get some comments that, especially when a lot of folks did side-by-sides or have used Pomona in a recipe they used Vernet for in the past, they noticed that Pomona attenuated more, was a little bit more drier in the mouthfeel. So if you were looking to recipe match or just in general for recipe design, you may want to consider increasing your mash temperature if you do not want a drier style of beer. just to keep that in mind. You could also consider adding dextrin malts to help with that mouthfeel, supporting that mouthfeel. Hop choice in addition will also influence these aromatics. Again, choosing hops high in free geraniol will help release that beta citronella, really help push the citrus, help push that lemon lime. But then later additions seem to push more tropical, and using Citra, for example, a hop high in free and bound thiols will release the free thiol, like 3-MH, for example, where you will receive more of that passion fruit, more of that guava, should you desire. Now I'm going to give it over to Richard. Hopefully everybody's still there. I don't have to start singing.
All right, that was awesome, Molly. Thanks for the overview on all the trials. I mean, I think it's really important to have so much research go behind supporting these strains, and it's been really cool to get to partner with Lallemand and get so much research done. And I think it's going to be super useful to brewers and show what can be done. Like even with 2 different beers, you get wildly different profiles of the thiols, the terpenes. Like it just shows what we're doing is complex. But if we have some of the data on how to use the strains, then that helps brewers to design better beers and just have more tools in their tool belt. So I'm going to be talking about how we made Pomona in the first place. So I think we can go to the next slide here. Yep. So story for us started with a mission. There's great yeast out there to make IPAs, whether it's West Coast or East Coast. But there wasn't a whole lot of development in making entirely new platform strains for IPAs. There are some cool strains out there that, they're little tweaks on existing strains, but we saw the need to develop a yeast that is really tailored towards this process of modern hop forward beers. Hopping rates and hop varieties have changed so much in the last few years. There's really a need to have a yeast that aligns with modern brewing requirements. And a lot of the yeasts out there are 40, 50, 60 years old. So there's definitely some room for improvement or opportunity to innovate. Go to the next slide. Okay, so I'll get into these in more detail, but long story short, in terms of how we made Pomona, we did a 2-step process. So there's lots of different ways that you can improve yeast strains or make new yeast strains. One that's quite common is yeast hybridization. So there are some LalBrew products, for example, like the Nova Lager, or I think the Farmhouse as well, that are hybrid strains. So it's the process of taking 2 different yeast strains and using a method to basically turn them into one using yeast breeding, which is great because it's a way to combine traits of different yeast strains into a new stable hybrid that then has the benefits of both parental strains. So it's a very common technique that's used to develop new yeast strains. And we're big fans of this method as well because we know a lot about the background strains, both in terms of genetics and in terms of flavor and performance. So it gives us the ability to design combinations. And every so often we find a winner like Pomona. And then the other method I'll talk about is called adaptive lab evolution. That's a really fancy way of saying, you repitch the yeast or grow the yeast in some kind of selective fermentation environment a bunch of times until it actually selects for beneficial mutations in that yeast, which end up making it, better at growing, better at metabolizing in that environment. So in our case, we're looking at IPA wort most specifically. Go to the next slide. Okay, so this could be like 90 minutes on its own. I'm going to just do a very basic overview of yeast hybridization. There's 2 main ways to do it. There's what's called spore-to-spore yeast mating, and there's what's called rare mating. Either way, the way this works is that you end up combining 2 different strains of yeast into a stable genetic hybrid. So that's not a blend. That's one single strain that has DNA from both of the parents, right? You're basically just got like 2 parents, 1 child. This is useful because oftentimes there's yeast strains that have interesting traits, but they have critical flaws. So you might have a yeast that's really expressive, really aromatic, but it doesn't flocculate very well, and it's diastatic, meaning that it's going to cause, some risk in breweries. But maybe you can breed that out. Maybe you can breed that with a yeast strain that has more efficient fermentation, good fermentation kinetics, good flocculation. And that's essentially what we did in the first step for Pomona. We took a yeast strain that was very aromatic, very fruity, very good at biotransformation, and we bred that with what we think is one of our favorite efficient ale yeasts. And that was sort of the intermediate process for Pomona. We use the rare mating technique in this case. They're both great methods. You get slightly different results based on the method you use. The cool thing about rare mating is that it's a really simple process. It's just a lot of work. You can do it just in a little test tube, essentially. And you can end up with new hybrid strains that you can, search for a winner among. So that's one important thing with all of these development techniques is that every time you do it, you end up with a bunch of different new strains. Not all of them are winners, so there's a fair bit of work in screening and selecting with hybrids. But you can often find some really, really cool new hybrid strains, and then that's something new that brewers can use to make new beers. So we'll go to the next slide. And then the next method we use, because we had a strain that we thought was pretty good, but it wasn't quite fully there in terms of the flavor production, the biotransformation. We used a method called adaptive lab evolution. So as I said before, you can think of it very simply as like really aggressive, really accelerated repitching of the yeast. This method, and you can do it for all sorts of different selective environments. You could do it in high alcohol, for example, to make a higher alcohol tolerant yeast. In our case, what we did with the parental strain of Pomona is we put it into New England IPA wort, a really highly hopped wort, and basically forced it to grow really fast in that wort over many, many, many generations. And then we could actually screen for colonies of that yeast that grew faster in that environment. And what that means is that the yeast is better adapted over time because it will just evolution never stops, and you will accumulate mutations in the population over time. Some of those have an advantage in terms of the fitness, and that makes the yeast better at thriving, growing, metabolizing in that environment. So that's what we did here in New England IPA wort. We put the parental strain of Pomona through this for a bunch of cycles, and then we're able to select for an improved strain at the end. And it's a very natural process. It's the same thing almost that brewers do with repitching. We're just doing it on an accelerated timescale. Next slide. So just to give an overview of exactly how Pomona was made, you have a rare mating process, you have a screening to select the best hybrid, and then you have a lab evolution process to further improve it, because we wanted to make sure that it had that stable haze. We wanted to make sure that it had fermentation efficiency in New England IPAs, hazy IPAs, or just IPAs in general. And we also wanted to it has the best possible biotransformation we can get out of that original strain as well. So what we ended up doing is we did adaptive lab evolution for 48 transfers, which is a few hundred generations of yeast cells. And then we were able to screen that adapted population, and we found one winner that we now call Pomona. So it's a bit of a process, but it's these are useful and practical ways that we can develop new yeast strains that are then useful to brewers to have new combinations of flavor and efficiency. Next slide. You want to take this over, Molly?
Yeah, so I mean, we could go together from here. But yeah, thank you, Richard, for that excellent explanation of how Pomona was created. We really wanted to show you also like what brewers are saying after our commercial partners, after they brewed with this strain, what did they think? And they really picked out on that fast fermentation, that robustness, but also the ability to maintain a stable haze and have this really incredible punchy aromatics linger throughout the beer. Richard, do you want to say anything on what you've heard from feedback?
Yeah, very, very similar. I mean, the feedback has been really positive on the dry version of Pomona. Something I want to mention is that we did have this strain available to brewers as a liquid yeast, because we do produce liquid yeast in Canada. And it's been really interesting to talk to brewers that have used both. And by and large, what we're finding is that that translation of liquid to dry has been very, very well received. Even in terms of what flavors and efficiencies do you get out of it. It's been very, very consistent. We've actually gone and done a study as well, looking at the aroma production between liquid and dry. And it's not necessarily true for every strain, but for this strain, what we're finding is that the performance, the flavor in the dry format is not distinguishable from the liquid format, which is that was also really exciting to see too. So we've had some brewers that have been using this strain for a year now, right? And it's been really good to have that comparison, and overall just really, really good feedback. What we're finding is that there's people that are now getting ideas to make even new beers, like never mind translating over existing recipes, but it opens up the possibility to make new brands with different flavor profiles as well, just because it's a different strain from some of the strains that they might otherwise be using. So that's always the most exciting feedback for me, is when people come to me saying, hey, I used it, now I've got all these ideas for new things. And yeah, across the board, really, really good to hear about how efficient it is, and how much people love that like peachy fermentation flavor.
Yeah, it's really expanding the catalog of what we thought possible with IPAs, which I mean, frankly, is really, really interesting and really compelling. Not everybody loves a juicy IPA that's just a single note, but we are saying, here, this is this yeast strain that will give you all the flavors of a tropical island. That's really compelling. We just wanted to finish on some frequently asked questions before we get to some questions. This slide deck will be available as well later on. But yeah, from what we have been hearing in the field and questions we've received so far, we just selected some that we thought were the most interesting and the most relevant for brewers to know. You can run down the list here. You guys can all read it, but you can use Pomona for other styles. We've seen success in brewers using it for like an American brown ale, a clear New Zealand pale ale, and for kettle sours. For temperature, we really don't recommend going outside that temperature range. There really isn't a benefit in terms of sensory or in terms of performance. Pomona can be repitched, and we've seen that done very successfully in these trials. A lot of folks commented on receiving like the average amount, but again, with repitching, it's important to note you really want to make sure that your nutrition is there for all yeast, but particularly if you are looking to repitch and maintain a stable yeast strain in terms of healthiness. How does pitch rate affect aroma? So from the commercial trials, we did see that a lower pitch rate favors potentially more terpene thiol perception. However, this isn't, that's not a hard or fast rule. Really, your hop selection and addition point are going to have a more significant impact than pitch rate in terms of aroma. Pomona is acid tolerant. We have seen that in kettle sours. It produces a really nice tropical fruit aroma. And it is easy to filter. Again, we've seen some clear beers made with Pomona quite successfully. And it is not a genetically engineered strain. So just something to note there as well. We have some resources from LalBrew Brewing and Escarpment here that we'll link to. But I think we'll close out the presentation and take some questions that I can't see the screen. I can't see your questions, but I'm sure there's loads, particularly what is Richard's favorite song to sing at karaoke? Here's some contact details as well.
Actually, there were some requests for sure. So we'll see if we have time at the end. There's a number of questions. I'm going to read some of them and start on the lighter side, and then we'll go deeper. Some of them, I believe, may have been answered already during your presentations. But thank you very much, Molly and Richard, for this fantastic introduction to Pomona. All right, so the first question I can actually take, we have a question on when Pomona will be available in 11-gram packs. for home brewing purpose, and that's going to be in September. Maybe we can write it down as well in the answer. Taylor, I don't know if we can do that. That way other people can read it if they didn't hear me saying it. So yes, September for the 11 gram packs, and then we will notify of the release our retailers and distributors. There was a question about where the name came from, Richard, and I thought this could be a nice one to start with. Since this yeast was already available in liquid form, you are the one that came up with the name that we loved so much and decided to keep for the dry version as well. Could you comment on it?
Yeah, our team came up with that name. So Pomona is was the Greek goddess of fruit. So we thought that was really fitting for this strain because it has such a broad ability to express fruit character in different types of beers. So yeah, we often do, go to mythology to name our strains. So it's pretty in line with some of our others. Like we've named strains after Norse mythological figures and Greek and Roman and all sorts of that stuff. So we're nerds is basically the long and short of it.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at the graphics that we've put together for the launch, then you can see the hand of the goddess Pomona. Yeah. So that's where it comes from. I have a question that either of you could answer, but maybe we'll start with Richard. Let's talk about the difference between Verdant and Pomona. That seemed to be a popular question in terms of maybe sensory and performance. If we start with Richard, Molly can add to it.
Sure, yeah. So the difference between Verdant and Pomona, Verdant is a fantastic strain. I would say one of the key differences is the attenuation. So Pomona does consume a larger amount of the fermentable sugars in the wort, on average about 5% more. So all things equal, it will produce a drier beer, a beer with a lower finishing gravity. Not necessarily a thinner beer, but certainly drier, with less residual sugar. And as Molly discussed, that can be adjusted. That's one key difference. And then as we saw in some of the data from the OSU and Niagara College studies, there are differences in the aroma compounds. They do have a lot of similarities, but if you saw some of those differences, like the isoamyl acetate, that ester is higher in Pomona. You saw differences in the terpene and the lactone profile, and you did see that the thiol release was on average a little bit higher in the Pomona as well. So you should see some differences in, all things considered equal. If you take the two strains and split them in the same recipe, you should notice a difference in terms of flavor, and that's backed up in the triangle tests that were done.
So, Molly, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Richard covered it. Yeah, it is exciting to see that there is, these are two different, but, expanding that catalog of IPA strains out there.
Exactly. I mean, we're looking at adding to the portfolio and not necessarily adding the same type of strain, but different flavor, and then great performance because of the hybridization process. On that topic, there is a question on there's questions on repitching. So Richard, you mentioned that you used adaptive selection to come up with this yeast Pomona. So how stable do you think the yeast is over repitching? And let's go over other questions as well. Let's talk about repitching and why we think this yeast is stable and can be repitched just like any liquid yeast.
Got it. Yeah. So how stable is the strain over repitching? I mean, one of the things we're up against as brewers is that yeast is always evolving. We can't stop that. That's actually a good thing because that's how we often end up with, new strains and things like that. That being said, in the case of Pomona, it may actually be more stable, if anything, because we've gone through that adaptive evolution process. It's something we've learned early on with making yeast hybrids is you always have to stabilize them. And, stabilization usually just looks like multiple rounds of fermentations. So that's kind of baked into the process with the Pomona, where we went through many generations. And one of the things that's known with this sort of forced evolution or lab evolution is that the obvious mutations will happen first. So if you get those out of the way, you can often end up with a strain that is actually quite stable when it's then reused in the brewery. And that has been our experience so far with Pomona. We have brewers that have gone multiple generations with it, and as long as the yeast coming off of the ferment is healthy, using best practices for nutrition and harvesting and repitching, it's been quite stable based on the feedback that we've heard.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, before we produce and dry any yeast, we also perform a stability test that is not over repitching, but it's stability looking at different colonies, single colonies of yeast, to make sure they are exactly the same genetically and there's no drift at that point. And similarly, after production, there is a genetic test as well to make sure there was no drift at that time either. Anything, Marley, you want to add?
No, but I think that's a really great point that Richard pointed out, that yeast strains that have done this hybridization really intensively, tend to be more stable because of that, the obvious characters that would have been, mutated, have already been mutated out by that screening. So it does give you a really robust strain the brewers should feel confident about using in their breweries. And, in the repitching trials that were done commercially, none of them commented on any genetic drift or anything like that they saw. And I think one of them went up to like 7 or 8 generations. But yeah, it's a really robust strain.
I'm going to stay on that subject with another question. Can you comment, Richard, on the parental strains of, are they classical brewing strains?
Yeah, so they are classical brewing strains. We're often selecting what I call underrated strains in our breeding programs. So in the case of Pomona, I can't say exactly which strains, but it's an English ale strain that's super efficient. Just we really love it for efficiency and robustness, super stress resistant. And we bred that with what's called a beer 2 yeast. So that's, if you follow the yeast genetics, it's a different family of beer strains that are actually more closely related to wine strains. And they inherit some of the cool properties of wine strains, like some of that really nice aroma production and biotransformation potential. But that parental, it has great aroma, but it has other flaws, like it's diastatic and it's slow to ferment and, all this other challenges. So we really use that one for the flavor. But yeah, a beer 2 strain, a diastatic non-phenolic strain crossed in with a really robust English strain, and then, a lot of selection and evolution to get to Pomona.
Excellent. There's another easy one here. Someone is asking, we've mentioned it briefly, that this yeast was available in liquid form previously. Someone is asking if it's the same strain.
It's the exact same strain genetically, and then functionally, we've done the comparisons, and the results are not, you can't tell them apart.
Yeah. All right. Moving from there, there's a number of questions. We talked about Pomona versus Verdun. There are some questions on New England, which is another strain that we recommend for hazy IPAs. Can Preiss, Molly, you can take that one. There's a question asking whether it's replacing it. That's the point either. It's just adding. Pomona is adding to the portfolio of IPA yeast that we have available. Can you comment how New England is different? So New England or Vermont yeast, some refer it as Vermont as well.
Yeah, so New England, the origin is a Vermont strain, and it is different from Pomona. It's also different from Verdant. We had this question when Verdant came out. Generally speaking, like New England does push more in the terpenes. It's higher in beta glucosidase. So you're going to get more of a citrus, lemon, lime character that's going to be more forward in those kind of styles than I would say the complexity that we're seeing with Pomona and with Verdant. But these are, as what Richard just said, like, we could keep through these the evolution and through these techniques, we can keep exploring and broadening the range of IPA styles. They're not, that one's not necessarily better than the other, they're just different. And so, once you really know your hops, and your malt bill, the kind of specific recipe you want to brew, you can really tailor your yeast strain to that recipe, and not just make, an overall New England IPA, but you can make a juicy IPA that is specific for this hop that will enhance this particular characteristic, this particular peach aroma, or this particular, lemon lime orange aroma. So yeah, they're different, but they're part of the same, hoppy style family. One's not really
Perhaps
better
we
than the other.
can Perhaps we can also refer people, I don't know if Taylor, you can add the link, but to our IPA best practices that really has a comparison between those strains in terms of performance and flavor. And I think that would be really useful to see. It's just one kind of snapshot picture on how they differ from each other.
Yeah, there are differences in different terms of fermentation temperatures and things like that. But yeah, that is a really great resource to refer to.
Okay, we have a very popular question here. Have you tried this yeast, so the Pomona, in a lower hopped pale beer, like a blonde ale or a Kolsch? Are the flavors different with the lower levels of hops?
I've not
Richard?
seen it.
Marlon?
Richard, I think you have it in your head.
We've had a couple trials in, like, I would say more neutral base, and that's where you'll get the base yeast character showing through more. Which is fairly ester driven in that case. So you will notice the like pineapple and like banana kind of esters a little bit more. It really shines in terms of hop biotransformation, but you certainly could make a blonde ale or a Kolsch with it as well. The one thing to watch out for is it is haze positive, so you might require some additional fining or filtration with those styles if you want them to be crystal clear.
Yeah, I can see it'd be interesting for a Kolsch, particularly leaning towards more dryness, but with some really interesting, like an American style or Americanized style of Kolsch, perhaps.
It could be really good. I mean, some of the really good Kolsches out there do have some, I would argue, a little bit of biotransformation going on. So
yeah,
that could be interesting.
Can you comment on diacetyl rest? I believe, Molly, you showed the slide that said there wasn't much production of diacetyl.
Yeah, there isn't really much production of it, and a lot of the brewers, you don't really need a diacetyl rest. I mean, that's really meant for lagers. Pomona doesn't produce a lot of diacetyl. Whatever diacetyl is there, it seems to quickly take up. So you can kind of throw it in your tank and not really have to worry about it. But Richard, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean that's always on the list when we're developing strains. Making sure that it's low diacetyl producer, and good cleanup. For any new strains, that's always a spec that we want to hit, and that's true for Pomona as well. I don't have a ton of data on hand, but we know from our own experience, even comparing it to some other IPA strains, it's usually clear diacetyl, like the forced diacetyl test. It's usually clear a day or two before a lot of the strains out there.
Yeah.
All right. There is a question then. The next most popular would be about pH level. What would you recommend? What about brewing and boil pH level for best aroma and haze?
I mean, I'm going to be really old school and probably controversial on this, but I don't think you should really mess too much with that pH level. Like, you really want to end at 5.2, kind of keep that. That's a really healthy range. But Richard, I don't know if you have more trending.
I follow your best practices in general. Like one thing to note is that compared to verdant, it does have a slightly bigger pH drop. So that does accommodate, for example, just bumping up your pH like 0.1 or 0.2 in the kettle, if that's going to be an issue for you. I know there are some people that really, really like their hazy IPAs to finish in the high fours. That scares me personally, and I don't do that. I try to keep it below 4.5. But you know, your mileage may vary. But yeah, it shouldn't require a whole lot of adjustment is the answer.
Yeah, and from what we see in the commercial trials, you know, brewers didn't really comment on it having to adjust their pH too much, and that haze was just present there. They didn't really have to manipulate it into being at all.
Okay, so there's a lot of questions. So I reckon we finish on a few quick ones, and then the others we can possibly answer in writing. Would that be okay with you both? And then people can just log in and look at the answers. There's obviously the yeast hasn't launched for long, but do you think Pomona would work well in a rum or whiskey? Should we do some trial on it?
Yes.
Why not? Right?
Yeah.
There's a question about a gozi, and we said it was tolerant to acidity, right? So there's no reason this shouldn't be a good option for a gozi.
Yeah, I think it'd be spectacular in a gozi.
There's a question on whether Escarpment and LalBrew are planning other collaborations. So
is that a karaoke one?
Yeah, it depends on the type of collaboration, right?
That's the next one on the list in Minneapolis, but certainly we're looking at other, and so stay tuned on that for sure. What else? What shall we finish on? The braggots and meads. Did you want to answer that one, Richard?
Well, the cool thing about having a yeast with the beer 2 genetics in there is that those are usually better because they're so closely related to wine strains. They tend to. The thing that beer yeast struggle with when you look at like a mead or a wine or a cider is fructose. Beer yeasts are usually not very good at fermenting fructose, and they often leave it residual. This strain should not have that problem because of the beer 2 genetics in there. So I have not used it to make a mead, but I'm sure it would work. We have done some trials with cider with really good results.
Yeah, I was just saying we have some trials that are outstanding now using Pomona with cider, but I haven't received that data back yet. That's a really good point about the parental strain.
And it's a really good segue into what's next. We have other webinars planned to follow up on this one, correct? Where we'll be sharing more information as we go along, as this yeast is making its way into the market in different countries over the world. We will keep sharing feedback and more information, and perhaps on other beverages than beer in the future.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. It's just the beginning. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you very much, everyone who joined. Again, the questions that remain, there's 19 of them, will be answered in writing by Molly and Richard. Okay?
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.